Say that you're annoyed about your current internet service provider. If you live around the California Bay Area, internet infrastructure can be surprisingly poor in a lot of buildings. So for most of the places I looked at, the only internet provider is Comcast Xfinity, because the building was only wired for coax and DSL, and was never updated with anything more modern like Cat 6 or fiber, because I quote the landlord, we already have high-speed internet. So if you're in a predicament like this and you want to use something that's not just coax internet, what options do you have? Well, in this video I'm going to talk about using the 5G cellular network for your home internet connection. Now, many of you might be thinking, what in the world possessed you to try to use cellular infrastructure for your home internet connection? And I'll go into more detail, but this whole thing started when basically I was doing a speed test on my phone in my room, and I noticed that I wasn't on Wi-Fi and I was still able to get 600 megabits per second. In Canada, I've only ever used LTE, so I was using my cellular speeds being roughly 15-20 megabits per second, which was a great upgrade over the chatter that would limit users to 1 megabit per second. So with this newfound speed, I figured, well, if my cell phone connection is faster than my home fiber connection in terms of downlink and is 3 times as fast as what I used to have for coax uplink in my old place, why wouldn't I just use this for my main internet connection? Now, turns out many people have had the idea, and so has the carrier cartel, because they already have this infrastructure that's sitting out here. In many parts of the world, for example in Turkey, instead of investing as heavily in fiber infrastructure, they're just trying to push more people to use like 4G LTE for their household internet connection. It makes sense for the carriers because they can put one tower up and service hundreds of users versus having to run cables to every single house individually. Of course, the downside of that is that your total throughput generally tends to be lower versus what you can send on a wire, and with higher latencies, just because RF is a shared space, which means only one device is normally transmitting at a time on a given frequency. In this video, I'm going to go over everything that I have learned in this rabbit hole of figuring out if this is a viable idea, how to even get yourself onto the 5G network, what the throughputs look like, and everything I've learned along the way between your options and bands and 5G modes and modems, so on and so forth. So first up, the easiest way. This is not a new concept. This has been around for a few years. It's funny because if you asked me 2 years ago if this would be a reasonable solution, I would have screamed like, are you crazy? Because my cellular speed just only be 15-20 megabits per second, and in my opinion, that's not enough for your home internet connection. That's just for the downlink. The uplink would be about a megabit. But given that I'm now able to get a very acceptable throughput, sometimes generally faster than what I can get on a wired connection, it begins to make a little bit more sense. And of course, the carriers know this, right? So if you're in the US, all 3 of the carriers offer a home internet solution for both AT&T, T-Mobile, and Verizon. You can go, just buy their modem, and if that's all you're looking for, you're in a rural area that doesn't have proper connectivity, or you just want a separate internet connection that you can carry around with you wherever you go, that's cheaper than Starlink, just go with one of those. Go with one of their home internet plans, and you can stop watching right here. If you're still watching, I assume you want to know a little bit more though. So really, you have a few options. Option number 1, you can just go to the carriers. Easy. They'll give you an all-in-one box. It'll connect to their 5G networks. You won't ever worry about SIM cards or modems or bands or frequencies or your devices or the Wi-Fi throughput, and you can live happily ever after. Now, if you don't want to do that, then we have a few options available to us. This video is centered around connections in the US, and in particular in the California Bay Area, just because that's where I happen to be living. If you are in Canada or in Europe, you will probably have very different opinions and very different advice. We need to face the realities. There's 3 carriers in the US. If you're in the California Bay Area, your 3 carrier options include T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon. Realistically, you're going to be getting internet from one of them. So before you begin, it's a good idea to at least know who has decent coverage in your area. I'm a fan of CellMapper, but the easiest way to do this is to what I have done is just drive to where I will be using the internet connection, get prepaid SIM cards, preferably if you can do free trials. US Mobile is good for this, and Visible is good for this, and just see what throughputs you can get. So it matters that you're testing this on a phone that obviously has 5G supported, 5G capable hardware, but this can give you a rough idea of what numbers to look for. So the easiest way to get started is to actually see what throughput you would be getting on either of the 3 carriers. It's also important to note that different carriers have different restrictions. For example, from my experience, T-Mobile is the most lenient with how you use their network. They were perfectly happy with having their MVNOs run my Canadian Samsung A52, as well as my current Pixel 7. Verizon, I found, tends to be a little bit more restrictive, where my Canadian phone would not work, but phones you purchase in the US, like the Pixel 7, work without any issues. Now, this might be because of a CDMA versus GSM issue, although that also shouldn't be as big of a point anymore, because the CDMA network doesn't matter after the sunset of 2G. Yes, it's still kind of online for some things, but they do have a CDMA-less provisioning process. I found that AT&T is the most restrictive. Not only did they not allow my Canadian phone, they also do not allow my Pixel 7, as it is not purchased through them, or that was at least the excuse that AT&T representative told me. In this video, I can only speak in depth about T-Mobile and Verizon, because those are the 2 that I have compared. There's a few things you need to recognize, and that's that not all 5G coverage is the same. Very important is that 3G versus 4G versus 5G sure applies to this generation of cellular infrastructure, but it does not actually mean anything for the frequencies that are in use. For example, you might have noticed that Wi-Fi also uses several frequencies. You have 2.4 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz, and today also 6 gigahertz access. You'll already probably intuitively know that the higher frequency gets you more throughput at the expense of reduced range. Very similar concept applies for cellular infrastructure, albeit much higher powers. Your Wi-Fi is capped at about 0.1 watts. Cellular infrastructure can go into the hundreds. I will upfront say, if you have anything less than 4x4 MIMO 5G coverage, stop watching this. If you're in an urban area, this probably isn't for you and you'd have better wired options. If you're in a rural area, you might not have many options anyway, so feel free to continue. Now, first, let me talk about those frequencies, because it matters. You will probably be picking carriers based on either A, who will provision your device, or B, who has the better, faster coverage in your area. A lot of that tends to come down to which bands are in use. So, I'll briefly refer to LTE as well, but primarily I'm focusing on 5G just simply because it can support much higher throughput. The 5G spectrum can be divided into roughly 3 frequencies: low band, mid band, and high band. In practice, low band is what we use for getting extended range communications. So this has carryover from the LTE days, but from about 600 megahertz up to about 800. So you have 650, 700. You have a couple bands there. Then you have mid-band. This is for general use with urban areas or where you might have a higher number of devices. In these cases, mid-band refers to, in the LTE days, to between 1900 and 2100. Although now with the introduction of C-band in 5G, it goes up as far as 3.5, 3.6 gigahertz. Finally, we have high band or upper band. Now, high band typically is also usually referred to as millimeter wave because the wavelength is about a millimeter, but that is frequencies over 25 gigahertz. Just as with Wi-Fi, the higher the frequency, generally the more throughput you can get, but also the shorter your range. Now, I say generally because just like in Wi-Fi, there's actually a second factor which affects the throughput you can get, and it's not just the frequency, but the bandwidth. The reason you can have faster coverage on 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi comes down to 2 actual reasons. One, with 2.4 gigahertz, typically the bandwidth is about 20 megahertz. So this means for each channel, how wide your spectrum is. You can imagine that the wider your channel is, the more data you can send. However, that comes with its own drawbacks, which is that it's also the more interference you get. So with 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi, you really only have 2 options, 20 and 40 megahertz bandwidths. And if you use 40, you are the asshole neighbor. So 20 megahertz means that you have 3 non-overlapping channels. Now with 5 gigahertz, the reason we have higher throughput numbers in general is because you can do 20, 40, 80 megahertz, and also 160 megahertz, and in some cases you can do 320 megahertz on 6 gigahertz. The wider the bandwidth, the more spectrum you have available to you for your transmission, which is what's enabling you to get faster throughput numbers. But again, as I said, it also means that you're more prone to interference across this entire spectrum range. Now, the reason the higher frequency cell is because if I were to do 100 megahertz wide bandwidth on 2.4 gigahertz, that would immediately bring me to 2.5. So it's just that we care less about 5 to 5.1 than we do from 2.4 to 2.5. And it's a similar principle in a lot of the cellular infrastructure. So in the 600, 650, 700, in the low band range, we are very constrained. So we're using narrower channels, great for range, because lower frequencies also naturally, just through physics, tend to be able to penetrate further. So if you're inside a building or in your basement, generally tends to work better. Now, for more urban areas, we use mid-band. Mid-band, again, 1900 to about 3.6 these days, because we also include C-band. These are, by the way, generally referred to as sub-6. So sub-6, you'll see this typically on modems, means you can get low band and mid band, but no millimeter wave. Now we have our sub-6 coverage. Mid band, the bandwidths generally tend to go much higher. So in C band, Verizon will happily use 100 megahertz wide channel bandwidth, which is how you're able to get 600 megabits per second on your phone. And that's also used in 4x4 MIMO. I'll talk more about MIMO later. And finally, millimeter wave. Millimeter wave, you can get multiple gigabits per second, but again, it's easily blockable by a piece of paper. So you essentially have to have line of sight with the cell tower, and this also very severely restricts where it's in use. So you will have 5G millimeter wave in some urban downtown cores. You'll have it in places like stadiums, maybe. But generally, if you're residential at your house, if you cannot see a cell phone tower, millimeter wave is basically out of the question. Now, thankfully, all 3 carriers happen to have spectrum across all 3 of these bands, just because it's generally very useful to have a long range and a high throughput area of cell band, so you can both support rural users as well as higher density. Every carrier has different marketing. For T-Mobile, for example, used to only have low band 5G. They were only operating in, I think, the 700 megahertz range. So they didn't really have any solutions for higher throughput numbers until the Sprint acquisition. I don't remember exactly which channel they're using, I believe channel 71. But once they took over from Sprint, they also got access to Sprint's band 41 now, which operates about 2.5 gigahertz. This expanded T-Mobile from, exclusively being low band, essentially for most users, to also having a mid-band option, which is what has boosted their throughput numbers. They also have millimeter wave, but again, I'm not going too deep into that one. Second up, we have Verizon. Verizon also happens to have a long range, as well as C-band 5G, which is primarily used in areas with higher density of devices. Now, they all have different marketing names for these. So T-Mobile, if you see 5G or 5G LR, that is the long range, so you're on low band. And if your phone advertises 5G UC, or what they're calling 5G ultra capacity, you are using mid or high band. And remember, in the past, 5G UC used to mean you were exclusively on millimeter wave, though today it refers to both the mid band as well as the high band. Verizon has similar terminology. If you're on 5G, you're just on their general longer range band. And if you're on 5G UW, or ultra wide band, you are on their C-band connection. Again, note that ultra wideband does not refer to millimeter wave in this case. They're just referring to the 100 megahertz wide channels. They're referring to the channels you also have available on C-band, which has a higher proportion of users. So how can you know what frequencies you're on? Well, thankfully, you have a few options. One, the nerds of the internet have already gone through and have driven with their phones, checking which frequencies they're connected to, and these maps are usually publicly available. For example, Cell Mapper. The second option is you can just check what your phone is currently connected to. On Android, there's a plethora of apps which will show you the connected tower, the tower ID, as well as which band you're on. And on iOS, there's a magic phone number you can call, which will give you information about your currently connected tower. So the only way to really know for yourself is buy 2 prepaid SIMs, go to your destination, do some speed test numbers. There's a second concept besides bands that you should be aware of, and that is the use of 5G SA or 5 versus 5G NSA. So that refers to 5G standalone versus 5G non-standalone modes. So similar to how when LTE was being rolled out, phones would still use the 3G network and as well as 2G GSM or CDMA for phone calls and SMS messages, and LTE would primarily only be used for data. That was originally to make the transition easier until we sunset the 2G and 3G networks, and everything had to move over to using LTE with VoLTE. The 5G rollout started similar. So to help accelerate the throughput, we started with 5G NSA or non-standalone architectures. This is where your phone connects to LTE as the primary connection and then is able to use the 5G band as an additional data channel for higher throughput. This is as opposed to 5G SA infrastructure, where your phone is able to connect directly to the 5G tower and to the 5G core network for everything. Now, in the US, as of filming this, which is in early September 2025, T-Mobile is the only operator that has 5G SA coverage. If you are on Verizon or you're on AT&T, you are using 5G NSA or non-standalone modes. What this means in practice is while your phone on Verizon or Visible probably shows 5G or 5G UW, if you use one of the cell monitoring apps or you check the connected tower details, it will probably tell you you're on LTE. So for anywhere around where I live right now, it'll always tell you, oh, you're on band 66 on LTE, even though it's also using additional 5G data channels. And again, just be very careful with when your phone advertises, oh, you're on 5G UW versus 5G UC. And similarly, AT&T has 5G-E, which actually is still just LTE. There's no real benefit to it other than a rebranding. So you should just do a practical speed test. Good options are I use iPerf against the OVH public servers, but another good way is you can use the cloud for speed tests because they definitely don't benchmark speedtest.net. Absolutely do. But you should also use fast.com. The last one matters because a lot of carriers will throttle video streaming applications to help minimize load on their networks. They have lots of sneaky ways where carriers will try to do deep packet inspection. More on this later. So once you have inspected at least the quality of the infrastructure in your area, now we can talk about how we can actually connect to it. Now, 5G SA versus NSA probably don't matter too much for application. It's just useful to know for when you're looking at statistics reporting, but also note that 5G standalone has lower latencies compared to 5G NSA operating modes. This can be noticed if you just start running ping. Now, how do we connect to the network? Well, assuming you're not going the easy route of just buying one of their home internet plans, you have a few options. The first is surprisingly also the most obvious. Just use a phone. Now, even in this category, you have two options. One, you can use your primary cell phone and you can just hotspot devices when you get home. I have coworkers who do this, and generally your phone already has optimized modem firmware, so if you know that your phone is able to get 600 megabits, you're already looking pretty good. Note, however, though, that carriers in the US do not like hotspots because the carrier cartel likes money. So while in most places in the world hotspot is included for free, in the US you need to double check, because most carriers will either limit your hotspot usage, so for Mint Mobile that is 5, 10, 15 gigabytes or whatever your plan is, although for their unlimited plans it's a lower limit. For carriers like Metro by T-Mobile, their second tier MVNO, they do not offer hotspot abilities at all. And for Visible, they offer hotspot abilities, but at reduced speeds. So it is something to keep in mind. There definitely aren't ways around it. There are definitely some workarounds you can do. For example, if you're on an Android phone, you are allowed to have your Wi-Fi hotspot devices tunnel through the VPN of your phone. At that point, it is not possible for the carrier to easily differentiate what is coming from your phone versus what is coming from a device on your hotspot, and so you're able to get higher throughput numbers. But using a VPN in this way will add additional latency and limit your throughput. The second option you have is to just use a second dedicated phone, preferably an Android device for this. So there's a few ways in which you could set this up. If you have a rooted Android device, you don't even necessarily need to use the hotspot abilities of your phone. So Lineage OS, for example, by default already includes drivers for USB to Ethernet devices. So you can hotspot devices with a direct Ethernet cable. I would probably have gone this way if I needed something portable, just use a second pixel, root it, install Lineage OS. This way, A, you can directly use an Ethernet cable connected to your existing router, and B, you know that the phone is already approved for the carrier, so on and so forth. The disadvantage is your phone is a ticking fire device. Eventually, the battery in it is not going to be particularly happy about being plugged in 24/7, and you're probably going to run into some issues around there. I will also just throw this out there for anyone whom it may be useful. If you are using WireGuard and an Android device, typically if you are using the Android's VPN mode, so you're not using the kernel module on a rooted device, it will correctly route hotspotted devices through your phone's VPN because it's already set up for that. However, if you are using the kernel module for WireGuard, it will not correctly let hotspot devices use your VPN. However, because you're rooted, you can also run IP tables commands to manually set this up. So an option you have is to have a phone that has a bash script that just runs all of the IP tables commands you need to set up masquerade, set up NAT. Note that you're going to be double natted, but that's going to happen regardless, and route all of the packets through whichever way you need. So option one, use a phone. If you're going this path, my choice would be a Pixel 7 that is rooted and has Lineage OS on it, just because it tends to be the most flexible, and this way you can use IP tables should you need any more advanced features. That is, however, not the only option. We also have two other categories, although you'll notice that these have a close resemblance to each other. One is to use pre-packaged, pre-made 5G routers or modems, and the other is to go the even further DIY approach. So let's talk about the first of those. There are providers, for example, like Gl.iNet, who already build 5G routers. So these are Wi-Fi routers with a 5G modem bundled in. And I will link it down below. But in the case of the Gl.iNet one, they're able to do 5G sub-6, so low band and mid band, and they have 4x4 MIMO. We'll talk more about why MIMO matters very shortly. The second option are you can get more dedicated 5G routers. So the two slightly more enterprise offerings I'm aware of come from PepWave or PepLink and Cradlepoint. So for the sake of recording this video, I borrowed this. This is a Cradlepoint E3000. This is an example of a prepackaged enterprise-ready 5G modem and router. In this case, this can be equipped with a 5G or 4G LTE modem. In this case, it has the 5G, can support dual SIMs for carrier aggregation or link failover, has 4x4 MIMO, as well as built-in Wi-Fi and all the Ethernet ports you would need, as well as SFP, PoE, so on and so forth. So this could essentially fit in as a router for an office in which you wanted to use either 5G as an uplink, more realistically as a failover solution. So you would route your primary WAN connection, and in the event that your primary internet connection dies, you would immediately fall over to the 5G network. These can be great. They generally have good throughput. They're rated for 24/7 operation. They're not going to blow up your phone. They're already certified with the carriers, but they do also have some downsides, and I'll get into that in just a minute. So I referred to 4x4 MIMO a few times here. This is one of the biggest differentiating factors of 4G LTE and the 5G NR spec. By the way, when I refer to 5G NR, NR just means new radio. It's in the same way that 4G had what's called LTE, 5G is typically called NR. I said that the biggest limitation of RF is that only one person can be using a given channel at a given time. So if you are listening on the 100 megahertz band, if someone is talking there, you also cannot have someone talking somewhere else. This is primarily what limits your Wi-Fi throughput. It's what limits your cell throughput. Basically, because you're looking for the presence of if a light is turning on or off, if many people have lights on, it doesn't really work. Now, MIMO is multi-input, multi-output. So with Wi-Fi, with the Wi-Fi spec, we got MU MIMO, or multi-user MIMO. There's also SU MIMO. Wi-Fi is already kind of had MIMO by using 2x2 antennas. LTE in the cellular world uses 2x2 MIMO. So you have two antennas, and you can actually be sending two different signals at the same time. How this works is, if you had one person listening, and I had two people talking, if you had one microphone and you had one person sitting listening, if you had two people talking, it gets harder to figure out who is saying which words, especially if they're talking the same monotone voice, which in this case the phones would be. Now the whole point of MIMO is that while we normally can only have one person talking on the channel, what if we had two people? And if those two people were at the same position, same problem. But if those two people are a couple meters apart, and I have receivers which are spatially separated, then we start being able to do some signal processing, so we can have two people talking on the exact same channel and still figure out who said what, just to the fact that the senders are spatially different, have a spatial difference, and the receivers are slightly separated as well. So that's the whole principle of MIMO, is that by having some separation, we can actually be sending multiple signals, different signals at the same time on the same channel. And just to the slight timing and amplitude differences between these separate transmitters and separate receivers, we are able to fully reconstruct the two original signals. This happens all the time in audio. For example, when you're on a phone call, the reason phones always have at least 2 microphones, or Bluetooth headphones have 5, 6, 7 mics, is so that they can do beamforming. So when you're talking, they can use the separation of the microphones to figure out exactly what's coming from you versus what is background noise. Now, beamforming is the second part of this, which is when you have things that have physical separation, we can slightly offset what we are sending to effectively shape the beam towards where the device is. Beamforming and MIMO are how we get such high throughput numbers with 5G and R. And remember, 4G only at 2x2, 5G is the first one that supports 4x4. So if you see anything with less than 2 antennas, no. You need at least 4 cellular antennas. Let's talk about some of the differences. So a consumer grade router like the Gl.iNet is just a typical Wi-Fi router with a separate cellular modem attached to it. This works exactly as you would expect. In fact, cellular modems, I'll talk about this in the third part of this, are very similar to Wi-Fi cards. They can just use the M.2 connector, although they're very different than Wi-Fi cards in many other ways, and especially with how they use that M.2 connector. But we'll talk about that later. So the consumer ones, you pay for the hardware. It includes the Wi-Fi router, it includes the modem, you plug your SIM card into it, your monthly expense is you're paying for the SIM card. So that's how consumer routers would work. This is in comparison to if you are buying enterprise equipment. Some of these can be had for cheap on eBay. They are quite tempting. But keep in mind, not only do you buy this $3,000 cellular modem and router, these things have yearly subscriptions. In this case, it is over $300 a year to keep this operational, basically. Now, that is for multiple things. First of all, that is for their cloud endpoints. So if you have a fleet of these, you can manage them from one portal. It's also for features like carrier aggregation. So this one actually, not the best example, because when the subscription length expires, it will still be usable as a standalone 5G modem and Wi-Fi router. There are others, however, in their lineup, where you will see them being substantially cheaper because they're called the 5G adapters. Now, those are cheap because they're basically the 5G modem, but they do not have their own control interface, and they rely on the subscription of their base router that they're attached to. So if you had a 4G LTE version of a cradle point, you could get one of these 5G adapters to allow it to use a 5G network, but you would still need that subscription. There are plenty of Reddit threads discussing if those subscriptions are in any way they're bypassable, or if you will in fact be stuck. But for the sake of this video, I will assume that this is not a rabbit hole worth going down for most users. Now, the Gl.iNet, for example, does not suffer from this problem because it just uses a fork of OpenWRT. That said, they're still using OpenWRT 21. That's quite old. The public release of OpenWRT as of filming is OpenWRT 24. So they're running outdated firmware, and if I were to pick up under the Gl.iNets, I would look at running it under the mainline firmware instead of whatever fork that Gl.iNet has cooked up. And again, the Gl.iNets, while a convincing package, aren't really anything too special in particular. In fact, a lot of these have a suspiciously common item. If you look at what is actually inside of the PEP waves and the cradle points and the Gl.iNet and most of these pre-made boxes, there isn't one of select few modems. Now, in the end, there's a person who makes the radios and makes the actual modem firmware. Normally, that's in this case Qualcomm. You really don't have too many other options. Apple, I guess, got away with buying Intel's old modem division, so they, I guess, make their own modems now. Samsung has their own 5G modems, but really, it's a pretty rare breed, so most people are just going to be buying something from Qualcomm. Now, Qualcomm doesn't talk to you directly. Instead, if you're buying a modem, you're buying it from one of Qualcomm's integrators. The biggest one of these is probably Quaketel. Quaketel, I first actually only heard of with regards to ThinkPads, and I'll talk about that in a second. But you have a couple others. So you have people who are using the 5G radios in a modem and integrating into a modem. And then these products are integrating the modem into their all-in-one router devices. Now, this is nothing new. In fact, WWAN cards have been around using PCIe for at least a decade. Typically, enterprise laptops, so your ThinkPads or your Dell Latitudes or your HP EliteBooks, have always had support for using WWAN cards, in this case, WWAN being directly connecting to a cellular network. Lenovo, unfortunately, has some restrictions with what they do, but I know on the latest ThinkPads, you can still get modems from Quaketel and use them in your laptop. Now, these days, they are all connected using the M.2 connector. very similar to how the Wi-Fi card works, but there's a few major differences to note. 5G modems are not like Wi-Fi cards. The Wi-Fi cards are typically Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and they use the A+E key. So they receive PCI Express, usually one lane of PCI Express for the Wi-Fi card, for the Wi-Fi connection, and typically USB for the Bluetooth connection. Again, these M.2 connectors are not interchangeable. This is as opposed to M key for NVMe SSDs, which is only PCI Express, although 2 or 4 lanes. You have B key, which can be typically used for SATA. You have A+E key for the Wi-Fi. You have multiple different notched versions of the M.2 connector. So modems also use a keyed version, but they're not necessarily interoperable. The benefit though is you can use modems in multiple different ways. So most of the modems on the market can be used in PCIe mode, in USB mode, and sometimes in direct Ethernet mode. Now this was first done for the flexibility of these devices, but it can be an impact on your decision. For example, in at least the current generation of ThinkPads, including my ThinkPad T14, the M.2 connector that is wired for the WWAN card uses PCI Express for communication. This is opposed to, for example, the Gl.iNet or the BPI-R4, where the modem is using a USB operating mode, and it's using USB 3.0 or 3.1. And there are also some devices on Amazon that connect it directly to use an Ethernet mode. Note that which modes you can use not only depend on what you're plugging it into, but depend on the card. So the physical modem you choose will determine which of these interfaces you are able to use. Now, it might seem strange that you can have multiple of these modes coming off of one modem card. And this is where we get to the second difference. The modem is actually its own computer. So you probably have seen Wi-Fi cards, whether they be from Qualcomm or, for example, like an Intel AX210 or Broadcom or MediaTek. Wi-Fi cards have their own firmware, but they're just plugged in and they use a driver on the host computer. Modems are completely different. Modems typically run a full Linux distribution inside of the Qualcomm CPU that exists on the modem. This is on top of the radio. This means that it's basically a full Linux computer, which is why they're able to offer these options like PCIe or USB or a direct Ethernet connection just using the I/O. Second thing to note is that these modems do not have SIM cards on board. It is on the carrier board that you would be plugging the SIM card in. Now, you have a couple of different options for buying these modems. Usually the easiest to get your hands on, what both the Gl.iNet as well as a bunch of these like off-the-shelf Waveshare devices on Amazon use, is the Qualcomm RM520N. There's a few different 5G modems from Qualcomm. The most common you can get your hands on are the 500. There's the 510, but that's a unicorn I haven't seen. It's also a very interesting one. There's the 520, which is the most common, and the 530. Now the 520 is very common, A, because it has approval from all 3 US carriers, which means you won't run into weird issues. Oh yeah, remember my note about how some phones only work on some carriers, like how AT&T won't let me use my Pixel and Verizon won't let me connect my Canadian Samsung? Same behavior exists for when you're using a modem. In fact, they can be even more restrictive. If you get the RM520, that one is sub 6, so no millimeter wave, but it is a full 4x4 MIMO card from Quaketel. It can use PCIe or USB. Now how you configure it is you send AT commands over the serial port. So you will open a COM port to the modem, and you can normally send AT plus whatever commands to enable, disable, have the modem switch between USB PCIe modes. But this is also where a lot of the other tips come from for how it connects to the cell tower, or how you handshake with it, or how, if you wanted to, you could send SMS messages. AT commands are literally just AT plus some string that you send over a serial port. It's shockingly basic, but it also works, so I guess no one has any better ideas. But the good news is you typically do not have to run these yourself. So the 2 big stacks you can use on Linux are either Modem Manager or Afano. Some modems will be supported by one but not the other. Some will be supported by both. It really depends, and you'll need to make sure your kernel version is up to date and has drivers for what you're planning on using. Modem Manager is slightly more common. It's built similar to Network Manager. You can configure it with your SIM card, how to connect. You need to manually configure the APNs and everything, but you can go that route, or you can use Afano. Very similar, you would config files, and these effectively act as abstraction layers where they will do all of this AT command communication for you, so you don't need to worry about it. Just make sure that whichever modem you pick has support for it. Now there's also other options. You can get modems from Telit. For example, there's the 980 and 980M, the latter of which is sub 6, and the M variant includes millimeter wave. You also have other modem carriers, although I didn't look too deep because in the US we're slightly restricted what you can buy. The Quaketel 520M is typically safe because it is used in the ThinkPads and the Gl.iNets, so at least if you see it in use in the wild, chances are it should work. These $3,000 devices really are just a CPU, RAM, typical network switch, a Wi-Fi card, and also just using one of these, not necessarily off the shelf, but using one of the 5G modems available to them. Now, these 5G modems will typically have 4 antenna connectors, again, because it's 4x4 MIMO. It's worth noting that cellular antennas are not the same as Wi-Fi antennas. Here is an example of a high gain Wi-Fi antenna. So this guy is, I believe, 9 or 11 decibels. It is important to note that this is using the female connector. So you will notice that you will have the center pin on your router device, and the antenna, this just rotates into that. This is as opposed to most cellular antennas, which use the reverse connector, where the pin is on the antenna. Now, this is made so that users don't mess these up, because you'll notice that these are very different. The Wi-Fi antenna is basically just a copper stick, where it's just acting as a dumb antenna. Cellular antennas usually have this paddle shape, just because of the different frequencies they need to match. So for Wi-Fi, you only got to optimize for 2.4 or 5 gigahertz, but these guys have to work everywhere from low band to mid band to, in some cases, millimeter wave. But you have options like this. You also have separate indoor and outdoor 4x4 MIMO solutions that are cellular antennas that you can use. And these are completely replaceable. So you can technically replace it with, if you wanted a separate bigger antenna for your window, or you wanted to put it somewhere slightly more convenient. It is, however, worth noting that the longer an extension cable with coaxial you use, you do have signal losses that way. So you just have to keep in mind if that trade-off is valuable for you or not. And here is just a look at the reverse side. So here's a connector for a cellular antenna versus the connector for the Wi-Fi. In this case, this device has 4x4 Wi-Fi and 4x4 cellular. Assuming you have picked out your modem, now you need a way to actually operate it. But before that, you now need a SIM card. Now, at first, this seems easy. We use SIM cards for our phones all the time. You can just get a phone plan and use it, and that's how you will get banned in probably a month, depending on how much internet you use. These carriers do not like the people who tend to use tens of terabytes on their unlimited plans, where unlimited means as long as you're in the 10% of highest users, you're probably fine. What is one to do then? Well, as I said, option one is you could have just bought that home internet plan from either T-Mobile or Verizon. It probably sure is looking like a good option right now when you're this far in the rabbit hole. Option two, if you know you don't use too much internet, then you're fine. Then you can just risk it and you will probably be fine. Or option three, you have to start finding actual data-only SIM cards that are meant for this use. Now is also a very good time to talk about data prioritization. Do not expect this to be faster than your cell phone, because most cell phones have higher data priority than whatever we are building here. There are exceptions, I'll talk about them. Now, data priority is typically referred to in QCI numbers. Typically, the lower the number, the higher priority you are, and the higher the QCI, the lower the priority you are. So you will see lots of posts on Reddit about, oh, T-Mobile, this QCI is for their postpaid subscribers, here's for their prepaids, here's the MVNOs, here's what they do for home internet. T-Mobile is known to have 5, 6, 7 different QCI numbers. On the other end, you have Verizon, where they have a prioritized and a non-prioritized data stream. So, for example, for their visible subscribers, the normal 5G that does not have access to 5G wideband is a deprioritized plan. For their premium subscribers, which are the $35 a month plan, they will give you priority on the first 50 gigs of data you use, but you're always prioritized on 5G ultra wideband. Now, at first I used to think that was a moot point because millimeter wave, no one has it. But this also means you have unlimited throughput on the C-band channels, which is incredibly useful. Note, however, for visible, the range is about 900 gigs. It used to be a terabyte. It seems to, according to Reddit, have crept down to about 800, 900 gigs a month, at which point you will probably get an email. This would be a not terrible option because you have decent high priority. On the other hand, AT&T, I don't know of what plans they have. You probably have to talk to their enterprise licensing department. On to T-Mobile. T-Mobile is a very interesting one because they actually do have unlimited plans that are nowhere on their website. So other than what they do for T-Mobile home internet, which is similar to what Verizon does for Verizon home internet, T-Mobile has a grandfathered in exception. For now is online. How long it will be online for, I do not know, but eventually this will probably be going away. History lesson. As part of Sprint's acquisition for licenses to certain frequencies, They made a deal with the FCC that they would get access to their N41 band and several other 5 GHz channels if they offered a very low or near at cost unlimited internet plan. Now, there are 2 people who are carrying this forward. Now, when T-Mobile acquired Sprint, this deal got transferred over to T-Mobile, and so T-Mobile still offers it. There are a few select nonprofits from whom you can get unlimited 5G SIM cards for the T-Mobile network. Many of them require you to have particular income levels, which means that realistically, if you're in the Bay Area, you already do not qualify. The one that's still available for everyone, though, is the Calyx plan. So Calyx, yes, the same Calyx that makes Calyx OS, is apparently a nonprofit organization, which I had no clue about. Now, Calyx, the nonprofit, not only has the membership tier where you can get a typical Android phone with the Calyx OS preloaded, although I know it's in a bit of a rough shape right now, they also have a Calyx internet plan. In this case, because of old license agreements, they are able to provision SIM cards for unlimited data on T-Mobile at a low priority. It is actually a decent priority for the first 100 gigs, and then it gets deprioritized. Now, their claim is that this is unlimited, and I've only used a terabyte on it, so I cannot comment for sure what's going on. So if you are on the Calyx plan, that is probably the best way you have to get access to the T-Mobile network without using T-Mobile home internet. Now, the biggest restriction of the Calyx plans was that they would send you a hotspot device, and the SIM card was provisioned to only work on the hotspot device, which the way this worked was you would give them $500, $600 for your initial membership, and they would send you the SIM card along with the hotspot device that your membership plan came with, and then the renewals would be cheaper and continue to work on the hotspot device. So they used to have a 4G LTE device option and a 5G device option. That's boring for us. I'm far more interested in what we can do the DIY approach. Now, very interestingly and thankfully, as of summer 2025, Calyx has a third plan called the Sprout membership. In this case, they do not send you any additional hardware, but they directly send you a T-Mobile SIM card, which you can use on a device of your choosing. Now this gets more interesting. Now, we have the ability to get a data-only plan, allegedly with unlimited data, albeit at slightly lower priority, but that has access to the full T-Mobile network. If you're going to the T-Mobile route, this is probably your best bet. You should just get the Sprout membership. Unfortunately, it's basically the same price as buying it from T-Mobile, but hey, at least you're supporting a nonprofit instead of supporting the greedy target. Now, the price. If you do this quarterly, it works out to $50 a month. If you do this yearly, slightly lower, about $40 a month, slightly over. So for $50 a month, this is the same price as T-Mobile's home internet. This is why I said at the start of the video, if you just want a 5G home internet connection, just get T-Mobile or Verizon home internet. It's not only the same price, they send you the modem and they do all the configuration for you, so you do not have to go through any of what we are discussing right now. But again, if you want to do this the DIY where you want to learn about how the cellular infrastructure works, sure, $50 a month or slightly lower, depending on if you go for a full year or you renew every 3 months. On the Verizon front, the only way I really know of is to just use Visible, because outside of Verizon's home internet, unless you're doing the business plans, they don't particularly have a similar deal that would get you unlimited data SIM cards. And again, Visible is great. They give you access to the full ultra-wideband network, which includes their C-band towers, albeit remember that it's on 5G NSA, but you're probably going to get yelled at if you use a terabyte. And this is partially because Visible is $35 a month. If they just said, we have a plan that's $60 a month, use unlimited data, I would actually be substantially happier. And with that, we're slowly reaching the end of what I have discovered so far. So I presented to you the modems that I think work, the carriers, which I think work, and it's time to put a bit more to practice. That's all I have for now. Personally, I'm probably going to use the T-Mobile Calyx plan, not only because it's hopefully true unlimited, but also because if my cell phone's on Visible, I'd rather have 2 separate carriers for obvious reasons with regards to reliability. In which case, if one of them goes down, at least I'll have the other plan running. Now, to give you a demo, I can show you on the Cradlepoint device, but realistically, this is going to depend on the modem of your choosing. So I may as well show you how we can use a modem of your choice. Now, an additional note on which modem you're choosing. The biggest difference between the Quaketel 520 and the 530 is that the 520 is sub-6 only, the 530 has a millimeter wave. That said, the 530 is only approved for use by T-Mobile, so you will not be able to connect it to the Verizon or AT&T networks. On the Telit side, I don't know. Now, if you are buying a dedicated modem, how do you connect it to your router? Well, you have a few options here. One of them is to use a solution like the Gl.iNet, which is all-in-one and includes the modem. Another option you have is to just get one of these holders. So in this case, this is an adapter by Waveshare to be able to connect a 5G WWAN card. So these just take in the M.2 connection for the WWAN card, and you would then just route the antenna lines from this side of the board over to the mini connectors that you see here, and you would plug in your paddle antennas over to these connectors on the board. When you have a board like this, this is also what acts as the SIM card holder. So if you're using one of these, you are basically requiring the modem to operate in USB mode. As I said, a lot of these modems support multiple operating modes, so you can use them as a USB device, you can use them with a direct RJ45 connection in some cases, and you can use them with PCI Express. Now, there's a lot of reviews of these guys saying that they don't work, and that's because you need to check compatibility and you need to do your modem configuration. Unlike Wi-Fi cards, just because it fits does not mean it will work. And you also get the little accessory pack, which is where you have the antenna connectors, a heatsink. In this case, the heatsink is required because 5G modems actually get quite toasty, unlike their LTE counterparts. And we have the usual paddle connectors, which, as I said, use the male connector. So you'll typically see paddle connectors for cell networks. And ideally, you would need these slightly spaced apart, like you see on the cradle point, or even on the card here, so that you can take advantage of MIMO. Now, one thing we have not talked about much up until this point is price. Obviously, outside of the monthly cost of the SIM card, so that you're looking at about $50 there, you have the cost of the modem and the hardware. So if you're buying an all-in-one business-grade device, expect to be paying in the upper hundreds of dollars range. If you go on eBay, you can get them for cheaper, but again, be on the lookout for things that require subscriptions for you to be able to use them. If you're going the prepackaged route, Gl.iNet sells their router for $330. Ignore the fact it's always on sale, it's always about $330. So in this case, they have a markup, and I'll talk about that. Then we have the cost of the physical modems, depending on where you buy it from. A modem like the Quaketel RM520 is going to cost you about $200 for the modem. So in the case of Gl.iNet, they're packaging it and giving you about $100 extra worth. They also sell the modem card directly on a USB carrier, just like I showed you. That is about $60. Again, on top of the modem, which is another $200. If you're buying directly from Amazon, also expecting the $200 range. Now, you can get RM520N modems for slightly cheaper. The best source for those is eBay, not from China. Ignore most of those, they might be blacklisted. But as ThinkPad spare parts, because there's a couple generations of ThinkPad laptops that use these Quaketel modems, you can get them on the cheap for as people look to repair their ThinkPads. However, there are caveats. For example, ThinkPads operate their M.2 modem port in PCI Express mode. A lot of these carriers use USB mode, so Gl.iNet's router is also operating in USB mode, I believe. There are some modem cards which have internal fuses, where once they operate in PCIe, they will no longer operate in USB mode. So be on the lookout for those. I don't believe the RM520 is one of those SKUs. Otherwise, you can also get, it depends what you can find in your local area. So if you use it in your ThinkPad, you should pay attention because, for example, my ThinkPad, while it has the connector, by default, the laptop does not come with a SIM card tray, and it does not come with the antennas, and you would need the 4x4 MIMO solution. So a lot of ThinkPads that were built for LTE probably only have 2x2 antennas, and you would need to upgrade that as well if you were to try to use this in your laptop. Now we get the operating modes. You have multiple ways in which you can operate these. You can either use a prepackaged router, like the Gl.iNet. Your option 2 is to use a dedicated computer. So you can get these M.2s either as USB cards, like the one I just showed you. There are also a few carrier cards which are wired for PCI Express. So you can plug it in as a PCI Express slot, just like you do for a lot of desktops that don't have onboard Wi-Fi. You then plug the modem into that, and then you can have the modem stick out the back of your computer. The problem there is you don't get the best reception under your desk on the back of a metal computer case. So the disadvantage of those, the biggest advantage of these USB cards, hands down, is that you can very easily use a USB 3 extension cable, put the modem somewhere by the window, and run it over to your router. That brings us to the next option. You can get a solution like the BPi R4. So the Banana Pi guys have been busy making routers as well that uses a MediaTek SoC. That one actually has a full support for M.2 and a modem. So they have two PCIes, I believe, on the bottom for the Wi-Fi solution. So I think they're using a 4x4 Wi-Fi 6 card. But for cell, you can also just pop in a modem. In that case, they're wired for USB. The other option you have is a lot of these USB devices. So first of all, as I mentioned, when you plug in this over USB, it just shows up as a serial device. So you just send AT commands to communicate with it either through a Fano or modem manager. Now, if you haven't done any other routers with OpenWRT, for example, behind the phone that I'm using as a camera, I have the Linksys MX4300, also known as the LN1301. Very popular router because they can be had for super cheap, and they have a quad-core like Qualcomm SoC on them. Those have a USB port. What I am going to try to do is I am going to try to use the USB port of my existing Wi-Fi router to just power and run the cellular card. The good news is with an all-in-one solution like the Banana Pi or the Gl.iNet or the Cradlepoint, modem goes in, Ethernet goes out. It's very easy to slot into your existing network infrastructure. When you're going this far DIY, you can either use a Raspberry Pi and run Modem Manager or a Fano on it. And then you'll need to have IP tables set up. And if you're going to also try to DIY your own router, you're going to need to make sure you have host APD working. Your other option is OpenWRT. OpenWRT includes a lot of the modules, has a lot of packages for Modem Manager, so you can hopefully simplify your setup. Now, again, this would assume your router has a USB port, preferably USB 3. So if your router already has USB 3 and it already mostly works, this will have to be a future video because we're at the limit of my knowledge. I haven't gotten to the point where I've been able to try this. This is just what I have learned so far. You can use your router's USB port with data so that the modem can communicate directly to your existing Wi-Fi router, and you can configure it as a WAN up. Maybe the most flexible, also maybe a cursed option. Time will tell. If I need to, I can always fall back to using a Raspberry Pi or using one of the PCIe cards. Now, the annoying thing is you buy the modems without necessarily knowing if they're going to work, so you just hope that it's going to work with your SIM card and with your equipment. I don't know if there's necessarily a better way, so if you guys are in the Bay Area and you see random modems up on Facebook Marketplace by a guy named Tony, at least you'll know where they came from. Hopefully you can snag a good deal. If I can get this all working, hopefully I'll have at least a guide or a page on my website documenting a lot of this in more detail, especially like getting it set up. All right, about 1 month has passed. As you can probably tell from the difference in background, I have finished moving, which means there's only one question left to answer. Did this plan work out? Was it all a failure? And what did I actually end up doing? If you recall from part 1, my original plan was to use the Quaketel RM520N, which is the most popular WWAN modem used in most of the portable travel routers. However, in that first portion, I also mentioned how my plan was to put it into a USB WWAN adapter. Unfortunately, that plan did not end up working. Despite checking that the version of the RM520N that I purchased would support USB, it looks like it might have been one of the Lenovo specific units, which means it is locked to only working with PCI Express, and so the USB compatibility did not work. So I ended up returning both the USB M.2 WWAN adapter as well as the Quaketel modem. So where did that leave me? Well, I had purchased a second modem. This guy. This kit was the same price as buying the single M.2, but as you can tell, this includes a full engineering sample and development. So what did I actually end up with? Well, this is a Telit evaluation board for the FN980M. Now this modem actually comes in two varieties. There's the FN980 and the FN980M. The difference between whether it is sub-6 or whether it supports sub-6 plus millimeter wave, this one being including the millimeter wave. Now this, we'll take a closer look at it at my desk, but this actually is two boards combined into one. So first we have the general development board, and on top we have the modem attachment. Now my thinking with this was other than the fact that it was slightly cheaper, I figured, well, surely the development platform for this would support both the PCI and USB modes. The good news is, yes, it did. The bad news is there's some other quirks with this that I'll have to mention. So then let's take a quick look at what I did actually end up with. This is a Telit FN980M. It's a 5G M.2 WWAN modem that also technically supports millimeter wave and sub-6 frequencies, though the sub-6 is more useful. As you can tell, this actually came with its actual own adapter. So you can see there's a base main board here, which contains some headers. Interestingly, there's two USB connectors on it for main and FTDI. There is actually an FTDI, so that's super cool for if I maybe end up debugging stuff that way. There's two SIM card slots, a couple of buttons. There's like power monitoring. There's 12 volt in. But in this case, It is just being used to plug in our top board here. The only annoying bit with this is I would actually like to be able to carry this places because it is decent. The problem is I can't carry it like this because A, it'll look very suspicious. B, these cables are definitely will get snagged and end up breaking off, which would be very unfortunate because these are hard to replace. Then you can see that these are sandwiched with some type of high-speed interfaces there. We have the second board. Now the second board is where the actual modem lives. So this guy actually has 5 antenna connectors. There's 4 for the sub-6 antennas. That's actually GNSS that would normally go to the center. So technically not required. It's for GPS. Then we have 4 millimeter wave antennas. Those are connected here. So these are 2-in-1 connectors. So you have 1, 2, 3, and 4. Of course, there's no millimeter wave reception here, so I have no clue how well they work. Now, interestingly, there's also a PCIe connector. This is PCIe female, so you'd have to find a male, it looks like X4 to X4 cable to actually be able to plug this guy in. Of course, the top of the board, you can't really see traces. I assume that these are all ground planes. Something, high-speed interfaces. You can even see like the traces for these. Just go here. So yeah, I primarily use a USB. So again, you don't use this one. You use this USB connector when you're using this board specifically. And it has worked decently well. PCIe I'd like to try, but never had a chance. So there we go. This is what we are actually working with in this case. It's pretty interesting. I'm actually, as I said, I'm kind of impressed that the carriers even let this onto their networks. But you know, it works. It works decently well. And unlike the QuakeTel one, not only does it work, it worked, and I was able to, even change config options if I had to. So overall, decently happy with that. So for the most part, my uplink has been the Telit FN980M connected to T-Mobile using just sub-6. There's no millimeter wave coverage here. But I've been able to use the USB mode to connect this over to my OpenWRT router, which I'll also show you on the desk. So just as I first mentioned, it did actually end up working, and now I have practical experience with this. Some further thoughts. The way I ran this, first, just as a first test, my initial goal was plug it into my laptop, see if I would get anything on the out. Now, when you plug a cellular modem into your computer, they actually present as several different interfaces. So as we previously discussed, most of these M.2 cards can be used for USB mode with Ethernet out or potentially with PCI Express. However, there's actually multiple different USB modes. So first you have RN-DIS, which is the general USB like Ethernet protocol. But then for modem management specifically, you have QMI, which is the Qualcomm management interface. This is supported on basically all of these all of these that are built around Qualcomm modems or Qualcomm radios under the hood, which QuakeTel, Telit, realistically, they're all integrators for the underlying IP, which comes from Qualcomm. And then there's also MBIM, which is specifically is a more general protocol for Windows. So these can actually be configured to run in one of multiple modes. Now, even then, you get multiple interfaces. You've got the network interface, but you also have, in many cases, /dev/cdc WDM like 0. But you also end up with 2, 3, or 4 serial devices or more. I don't know if how in depth I discussed it in my previous video, but a lot of these modems are built around sending simple AT commands and getting answers back. So most of pretty much every modem is configurable through AT commands. So either you're going to have to type AT plus your command name, and in that case, it would be to connect it to 4G or connect to 5G NR. You'd have to manually provide the APNs. You could configure which tower. You could configure which band. There's a bunch of AT commands to change every part of the radio. The actual PDF of the supported AT commands for this modem is 600 pages long. Potentially a bit of a chore. The reason you have multiple interfaces, though, is typically you will want to be configuring on one, and then you can use the second interface for monitoring. So if I'm making changes and I'm poking at it to change channels or whatever, I want some indication to knowing, hey, what's the signal strength? What's my throughput rates? In that case, you can be doing periodic logging on one interface while you use the second one for control. Now, of course, you could run these AT commands yourself. There's many wrappers you can use that simplify the configuration and setup. So what I'm going to discuss works for normal Linux. However, I have also, once I got it working on my computer, then the next step was obviously to port it over to my router, which is running OpenWRT. So in terms of high-level abstraction layers, there's really 2 control applications. One is Modem Manager and one is Afano. Now, these two are effectively like a network manager or a command. They're high-level control interfaces where they will abstract away most of this AT command configuration, and you can deal with the higher level, use 5G connected to this APN type situation. They'll also configure whatever settings need to be configured. Realistically, if you're going to use a modem on a computer, you're probably going to be using, these days, more likely modem manager. Of course, if you don't want to, there's also, you can just normally configure it and then you can add it as a CDC or MBIM device without having to go through modem manager. Of course, the disadvantage with modem manager is it is a little bloated. It is a bigger library because it is supposed to be considered one of the more magic setup and configurations options available. So next, on the OpenWRT side, OpenWRT actually supports you using either MBIM, CDC manually, or you can also configure network or modem manager. And there's also conveniently an option to have modem manager show up in Lucy as an interface. So this means you, realistically, if you're doing this for yourself, won't even have to dive into the command line. You'll just need to grab modem manager. If you have a Qualcomm modem, make sure you grab QMI so it can use the faster modes. When I first did this, I plugged it into my desktop computer, and after some configuration and tweaking, I was able to get 300 megabits per second. Then I plugged it into my OpenWRT router, and lo and behold, my speeds were down to 8 megabits? Hold on, something must be wrong. There's two things you got to check. One, there is some overhead to this, so make sure you're using a USB 3 cable and not a USB 2 cable. But second and most importantly, by default, it was not using one of the high-speed interface modes for, realistically, QMI tends to be the fastest. But if you're having issues with it, MBIM is also an option. Or, for example, if you're not using a modem that uses Qualcomm technology under the hood. I actually had some issues trying to do this directly with QMI, and in the end, Modem Manager ended up working the best for me. However, there are some caveats. I do typically have to restart the Modem Manager interface, and T-Mobile will randomly downgrade my modem to LTE. I'll be going very good at 300 megabits per second. I'll come home the next day, and I'll be getting 80, 60, 50. In one case, I came home, and I was getting 8 megabits per second, and for some reason, it had reverted modes, and there's a lot of interesting shenanigans that can happen. The other problem is it doesn't correctly come up on startup. So if, for example, I have many instances where I need to come over here, unplug the USB cable and replug the USB cable, where power also doesn't do it. But for some reason, like re-plugging in the USB cable and having it rebind to that interface device correctly causes it to show up, and suddenly Modem Manager picks it up. It's very bizarre, though, because I have many instances now where the serial ports are there, the ACM port is there, but if you do MMCLI-L, it goes, no modems are available. Then the question becomes, well, what do you mean there's no modems available? That is one of the issues that I have not been able to fully debug. Now, was it worth it? Do I use this? Well, now that I'm about 2 months into my Calix subscription, I have mixed opinions. One, when it works well, I do genuinely get better speeds than I would be able to get through, say, the Xfinity. I do generally get acceptable speeds where I'm able to get 200-300 megabits download and about 30 megabits upload. However, there are a lot of times now where it will either jump towers, or the other one I see very often is it randomly degrades from 5G NR over to 4G LTE. And once it's on LTE, it doesn't go back to 5G. So in that case, I was actually using it for a week and I didn't want to necessarily restart it, but I was just stuck on LTE. And the only way I know of is restart Modem Manager. So, and there have been instances where I've tried to manually fix it by querying stuff with AT commands. But the problem is, once you, generally, it ends up losing connection. And if you try to reboot it, guess what? You also lose connection because it will not recover from these issues where the modem will restart, but now your modem manager doesn't pick it up, or there's a lot of variables that can end up breaking or causing issues. That's to say, given some things like the Pine phone use a USB modem, I'm impressed that the devs have been able to make something like that as smooth and reliable as it is. Of course, a lot of Android phones used to use USB modems as well. This was before they all started getting gobbled up and incorporated into the main SoC along with the 5G. The other thing that probably has been affecting my quality is I'm still using these stock antennas. For my point, I literally just tested around this building. I put it in front of every window possible, and I found that the bedroom window by the corner had generally the best reception, which makes sense because I spent way too long on Cell Mapper beforehand looking up where the closest phone towers are. That's also why I know that, for example, in this area, T-Mobile really is kind of your only option. Because with Verizon, in theory, I have ultra-wideband, but in practice, I'll end up just falling back to their 700 megahertz band. There's some other good news about this, by the way. So despite the fact that I thought this was a production FN980M when I purchased it, however, it does clearly say engineering sample. That's going to be good or bad. On one hand, some engineering sample IMEIs are whitelisted by the carriers, but I was very much expecting this to not work on Verizon. I haven't tested AT&T. Pleasant surprise is that this was able to correctly, I tried using the visible SIM card from my normal phone, and this was able to provision and connect to the Verizon network. So despite the fact that only the FN980 non-M was certified by all three carriers, the 980M does also at least appear to work on Verizon. Now, of course, this has 4mm wave antennas, one there, one on top, one on the bottom. There's 4 in total. I haven't been able to test any of those because there's no millimeter wave reception around here, and realistically, I wouldn't even be able to test that behind my windows. I would probably have to have actually direct line of sight to the phone tower. Beside these 5G shenanigans, there is one other option that you should consider if your only ISP is Xfinity and you really don't want to give too much more money to Xfinity. And that is, before I moved, I wasn't aware that you could only pay for Xfinity's hotspot. The apartment I'm currently in, again, this whole place is only wired for Xfinity. But one of the things Xfinity does is whenever a residential or a business customer subscribes to the Xfinity package, by default, they actually enable a public hotspot on that modem. Generally, this means that if you're, for example, business, you would automatically have like a guest Wi-Fi. In the past, I ran under the assumption that you had to be an Xfinity subscriber or customer to be able to use the hotspot. For example, that's the thing with Xfinity Mobile, which also piggybacks on Verizon, is you have to be an Xfinity internet subscriber. However, the Wi-Fi hotspots, you can purchase access separately, and it is only $10 a month for allegedly unlimited access. Now, this presents a very interesting scenario because this is $50 a month, and really the cheapest SIM card you would be able to get from someone like a Mint Mobile is $15 a month. So having an option for 10, when realistically, since this whole building is Xfinity, I know my neighbors are broadcasting the Xfinity hotspot. So you can just piggyback off of that. Just like with using cellular, you also don't get a public IP address. So be prepared to have a VPS nearby that has a static IP if that is something you require. My current link speeds, my link rate to the router, to the Xfinity hotspot at 80 megahertz channel width on 5 gigahertz is almost 2 gigabits. It's about 1900 megabits per second. Now, what speeds would you get through this? I know that, for example, Xfinity has started to upgrade its region to DOCSIS 4. So at first I was a little hopeful, and they will sell you a gigabit plan. Unfortunately, the Xfinity hotspot very much appears to be throttled to 60 megabits per second. It's very interesting because at first they will let you burst up to about 150 or maybe 200. I don't know what the limit on the burst is. So if you're doing something that's less than a megabyte, you will get burst. But immediately after, it ramps back down and you will be stuck at 60 megabits per second down, maybe 64, but I've been very consistent at 60, and 7 to 8 megabits up. At first I was hopeful because, again, my whole first reason I started doing this was faster upload speeds. Nope, their hotspot is pretty slow. But if what you're looking for is cheap home internet, skip buying yourself an internet line for which they're going to charge you $50 a month for the thing with a 1.2 terabyte limit, and just use their hotspot. It's cheaper, and realistically, if you don't need a public IP, you're probably not going to notice. The ping's also decent. The upload speeds, again, are a little disappointing, and I think it appears to be hard capped because I've done multiple speed tests, but then I also ran extended iPerf tests against my server. So I've tested against both my server with OVH over in Beauharnois, and also tested with a server that I'm renting in California, closer to Los Angeles. And it's been very consistent. So if I let it run for over 15 minutes, my throughput remains very consistent. Now, maybe I thought it was just the one neighbor. So I went through my OpenWRT box and picking all of the different versions of Xfinity Wi-Fi that I could find nearby that are within acceptable range, same speed. So remember, by default, Xfinity only gives their customers two options for channels, by the way. Channel you're either going to be stuck on, I believe, like 36, one on the lower 5 gigahertz band and one on the upper 5 gigahertz band. In my case, I'm using the Linksys MX4300, also known as the LN1301 with OpenWRT. So what this means is I'm able to use it to piggyback off of a Wi-Fi. So I can use an incoming Wi-Fi as my uplink. Now, of course, normally this means that you only have a single 5 gigahertz radio. So you'd be stuck on either one channel or the other. The Linksys MX4300 is a tri-band. It actually has two 5 gigahertz radios and one 2.4 gigahertz radio. So I can actually have my networks operate off one of the 5 gigahertz channels, radios, and I can use the second radio dedicated for my WAN connection to the Xfinity hotspot. This way, there's no channel hopping happening. That can remain on that channel, and this means that my downstream traffic is not colliding or interfering with that because I can conveniently put myself on any channel I want, including DFS because I'm indoors, whereas the Xfinity modems do not allow that. So that's also another option. Now, at $10 a month, though, this also brings up another possibility, which is if you're using either, you can do one of two things. OpenWRT has pretty good support for multi-WAN. So you can actually set up 2 WAN devices. In my case, my intention is I'm going to have one use the cellular and one is going to be based on Xfinity. So my goal is, I think the way I'm going to run it is the cellular is going to be my primary uplink and the Xfinity line will be my secondary uplink. This way, if one of them has an outage or has an issue because I misconfigured something, the router can immediately fail over and connect to the second one. Realistically, if the Xfinity hotspot had been over 100 megabits per second down and about like 20 up, I would have canceled my cell subscription because realistically that's good enough for me. Unfortunately, as it stands, they're a little too conservative with the speeds they're willing to give. And obviously, I have to assume this is so that it doesn't cannibalize their more profitable business too much. With that, there you have my conclusion. So my current internet situation was still cellular, but I recently played with Xfinity hotspot. Maybe I'll switch, but I might just use it as a dual uplink. Of course, that means now you're paying for 2 lines. I was able to use a Telets modem, not the original Quaketel that I expected. However, it still worked. I did use compare it against the Cradlepoint, and of course the Cradlepoint was able to edge this out, probably better antennas, better tuning. Also, its software is a little more intuitive with being able to lock the towers. Now, that is one other thing I should discuss on is, for example, if you use the Gl.iNet devices or you use the Cradlepoint, their default software already has band locking and the ability to pin to certain towers. This is incredibly useful because I know there's one tower that I always want to use and I know the frequency on it that I want to connect to. Because in this area, T-Mobile actually operates both an 80 and 100 megahertz wide band within. So I would rather pick one. Unfortunately, this is not possible with Modem Manager. Now, I don't know if it's just because of this Telet modem not exposing it, but I've gone through the AT commands and I've tried to do it that way and it also hasn't worked. So now I'm very curious how Gl.iNet and these other guys are able to do it. Presumably they have some interface they're using, but I don't quite know what it is. The reason I don't use Gl.iNet though, however, is their OpenWRT versions are very much seem unmaintained. So today we're on OpenWRT 24. They're on at least a version from 4 or 5 years ago, which for something connected to the public internet doesn't exactly give me the most confidence. I'd rather be running the most up-to-date version. There you have it though. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you now have internet access that's maybe faster or maybe more reliable or for failover purposes. Of course, this is a bit of a high-level video. I didn't go too deep into actually configure this and set this up on your OpenWRT router. Thankfully, there's lots of very nice, helpful pages on the OpenWRT wiki for that, which I will have linked in the description down below. Of course, if you guys would like a video tutorial on it, I still have the option. It's just once I have it set up, this means I would need to delete it and reconfigure it to be able to show you the same thing, which I used to do by having 2 SD cards for a Raspberry Pi, but I kind of don't have that set up anymore, so it's a little bit harder for me to go and reproduce. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions, and otherwise I will have the OpenWRT wiki linked in the description. All right, with that, we are at the end of my current knowledge. This is as far as I know about using 5G for home internet, as far as I know about how to use a modem, how to get a SIM card, how to try to get it all wired up. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully this has been at least somewhat useful if you are trying to replicate a similar setup. I'd like to thank you all so much for watching. I know this has been a very long. If things worked or didn't work for you, please leave them in the comments, and I'll try to carry them over to my website so we at least have some crowdsourced knowledge, information base, because a lot of this seems very obscure and not very well documented, because sensibly most people do not go down this rabbit hole. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you learned something. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.